Thank you for downloading this podcast from Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk. For more podcasts and more information on your number one news and talk station, please visit 702.co.za or capetalk.co.za.
Stand up for the law. Stand up for decency. Stand up for compassion. Stand up for respect. Stand up for your community. Stand up for your future. Stand up for South Africa. LeadSA.co.za.
The Naked Scientist on Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk with Reedy Clubby.
Hello, Chris. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Very, very well, thank you. We just have had a very emotional and sad conversation with our listeners. There's a man who committed suicide because he got retrenched by a cell phone company. So that's what's been dominating our conversation in the first half hour of the show. But anyway, let's just move on then. If you're listening and you want to ask the Naked Scientist any questions, do give us a call on 021-446-0567, 011-883-0702. We are taking your SMSs as well on 31702 and 31567. Join us as we strip science down to its bare essentials. All right, Chris, I've got some SMSs. One from Rainier who wants to know, do birds have a sense of smell?
Birds have a very good sense of smell. If you look at the tops of their beaks, you'll see they have two little openings, and those are their nostrils, and those work in exactly the same way that human nostrils do. And the air goes up the nostrils. At the top of the bird's beak, where its skull is, there is what's called the olfactory epithelium, and there are lots of tiny nerve fibres dangling down into the airstream there. They are decorated with these tiny chemical docking stations called olfactory receptors, and these little proteins recognise, rather like a key going into a lock, the molecules or the shapes of the molecules of things coming in from the air, and those are odorants, and when they dock with their relevant receptor, they stimulate the nerve, and the nerve then sends signals up into the bird's brain, which decode what the different spectrum of smells experienced together is, and that's what birds and we both call smells. Birds also have very good vision.
Peter wants to know, I'm allergic, he says, I'm allergic to penicillin. Is it possible to become unallergic to it later in life, or is it permanent? I thought that was interesting.
Well, the reason we have allergies, and penicillin does cause these occasional drug reactions. Frequently people get rashes and things when you give them these drugs, and it's because the penicillin molecule ends up activating the immune system, and you get a complex between an antibody and a penicillin molecule in the bloodstream, and this complex deposits in a small blood vessel somewhere and recruits a chemical from the blood called complement, or a system of chemicals, and complement is one of the ways in which the body normally attacks microorganisms like bacteria. And so it thinks that this complex between the antibody and the penicillin molecule is because it's found a bacterium, and you then unleash this complement cascade which damages the blood vessel, and you get a little bit of blood leaking out, which is why you get the red rash. Normally when this happens, you can't unlearn to have that immunity or that immune response. It's only in a fraction of people, maybe one person in 20 or fewer, who actually have these kind of reactions, thankfully. But it probably stems from the fact that penicillin is actually a molecule produced by a fungus. So it originates from a microorganism, and some people have an immune system which is programmed to detect that particular molecule, and so it's very unlikely you're going to desensitize yourself. That's if it really is a penicillin allergy, because sometimes people have a dose of penicillin, they get a rash or some other reaction for some other reason, and then they think, well, this is probably down to the penicillin, because that's the safe decision to make, because you don't want to keep dosing yourself with something to which you may be allergic. And so there's probably also a group of people who aren't really allergic, but they had a reaction at the same time as they took the drug, so they think they're allergic.
Okay, let's go straight from that to Mandla in Dunkeld. Hi.
Good day, Reedy. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good, thanks. I want to ask Chris a question on vultures.
Vultures?
Yes.
Okay.
How do they find their prey? I'm asking this because when an animal dies in a national park or game reserve, just immediately you see vultures hovering around it.
Okay, so how do they know and sense that there's a dead body there?
I don't know the answer for sure, but I would say there's a very high likelihood that they use their eyes. because, like many birds, vultures have good eyesight. Most birds are blessed with exceptionally good eyesight, especially birds of prey. You see them hovering maybe 200 feet up in the air and looking down, and they're able to spot tiny things like mice from that high, because they have a retina which is very well adapted to being able to focus in on a very tiny spot and discern extraordinary levels of detail from a very tiny part of the visual world. I suspect that vultures also, we know that they have very good colour vision, and that's why they're very colourful themselves, because they actually take carotenoids, the red-coloured pigments from the things they eat, and put them into their skin as a display, as ornamentation to attract a mate. So we know they're very good at colour vision. And I think that they're probably looking across a fairly featureless landscape, and they can spot an animal-shaped thing in the featureless landscape from quite a long way away, and then they home in on it, have a closer look. That looks like it could be dinner coming up, and then they hover around waiting until the animal dies rather, and then they fly down and make a meal of it.
Interesting question, Mandla. Thank you very much for calling with that one. Let's go to Paul. Paul, you are calling us from Fourways. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Hi. Before I ask my question, I just want to add to the previous thing about the eagles and their vision. I believe the eagles actually have a kind of bifocal vision.
You're right. If I don't know about eagles specifically, but I do know about kestrels. And if you look at the retina, they have a sort of V-shaped retina, and that means that as they get closer to looking at certain things, they focus the light onto a slightly different part of the retina, which has a much denser array of these photoreceptors, so that they have extraordinarily precise and accurate and high-resolution vision over a very small part of the visual world. And I guess that's what you mean by bifocal vision.
Yes, pretty much. My question is light. If light is not interrupted, if the photon doesn't hit anything, does it travel indefinitely?
Yes, the photon is an electromagnetic wave, so you can think of it as both a wave and a particle. So when it hits something, you think of it conveniently in terms of being a particle, but when it's travelling, it's a wave. And this is an electromagnetic wave, which means you have a changing electrical field propagating. And if you have a changing electrical field, then you have to have a changing magnetic field, and the two just alternate and propagate through space until they hit something. And when they hit something, they impart the energy in the wave into that thing, and that thing then either gets hotter and gives out different light of a different wavelength, infrared, or it moves. And in the case of an asteroid, for example, we know that some of the asteroids that have hit the Earth have been dislodged from the asteroid belt by photon pressure. So when photons impact on bodies in space, they can impact a little push to it, and this is called the YORP effect, Y-O-R-P, Yarkovsky-O'Keefe-Radzyevsky-Paddock effect, Y-O-R-P.
I'm not going to try and remember that.
I was saying good luck to you, Paul.
And it's because the photons all have momentum. Even though they're travelling at the speed of light, they do, when they hit the object, have momentum, and they give it a little push. So if you have enough light hitting something for long enough, then they will actually impact some momentum, impart some of that momentum, all that momentum, onto the thing they hit, minus whatever gets reflected off, and it will make it move, and it's enough to move an asteroid.
Thank you, Paul. And John, you are calling us from Rondebosch. I'm so interested in the answer to this one. Good morning.
Hi, Reedy. Hi, Chris. I just want to know that if you cook with wine and say you make a stew and you add wine and the water boils, the alcohol obviously boil off at a lower temperature. Is that food safe to serve to an alcoholic?
It depends on how much alcohol is still sitting in the food. The boiling point of alcohol is considerably lower than the boiling point of water, which is how we're able to distill whiskey and things. It depends, though, on how long you have heated the food, because the alcohol will be mixed in with the water, and it doesn't, just because the temperature of the water that's in the food is, say, 90 degrees, it doesn't mean that immediately all of the alcohol boils off. If you add some alcohol, a proportion with time will boil off, leaving behind a portion or proportion, and therefore the longer you heat it for, above the boiling point of the alcohol, the lower the likelihood of there being alcohol left in there. But that means that there will always be a tiny, tiny bit left behind, because you'll never get rid of absolutely all of it. So I think it probably is safe to serve to an alcoholic person as long as there isn't huge amounts there that they're going to be able to discern, and biochemically it's not going to have a very big effect on their body if it's there in tiny amounts. But if it was there in appreciable amounts, then it could have a problem for them.
The Naked Scientist on Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk with Reedy Clubby.
And I have no comment to that yet. The censorship board has classified the spear as not suitable for viewing by anyone under the age of 16. We'll talk about this another time. Right now, on 021 446 0567, 011 883 0702, we're chatting to the Naked Scientist, Sam in Randburg.
Hi, good morning, Reedy. How are you?
Fine, thank you. What's your question?
My question is, viruses are regarded as living organisms, and then they tend to affect or attack our bodies with different diseases. I was wondering, if they are living organisms themselves, don't they have diseases? Then therefore scientists can be able to wage a biological war to them and kill them?
Hello, Sam. Yes. So there's this old sort of saying, do fleas have fleas? In other words, rats are a mammal, and living on a rat is a flea. Is there a flea that lives on the flea that lives on the rat? Is there the equivalent for viruses? And the answer is yes, there is. There are a family of viruses which were discovered in the last 10 years or so, which are huge. They discovered the first one, and it was so big that they called it a mimi virus, and then they found an even bigger one, and because it was the mother of all viruses, it was bigger than some bacteria, they called it a mama virus. And when someone looked very closely at this mama virus, which was discovered in France by Bernard Lascola, I think, was the guy from CNRS who discovered this, in water from a cooling tower. And it actually eats amoebae. It lives in water from a cooling tower. And when they looked in this virus, they found that inside the virus were these tiny particles that they dubbed Sputnik after the Russian satellites, because they appeared to be these tiny little round balls inside the virus particle that was inside the thing it was infecting, the amoeba it was infecting. And they then thought, well, what are these tiny particles in here? Because they're not always in the virus. And then when they investigated, they found out that this is a subvirus. This virus preys on the mama virus. So basically what you've got is a virus and a little virus which doesn't have very much genetic code of its own. So it infects a cell that's already infected by a different virus. And then it steals some of the things that the other virus is making to make itself. Usually what it does is to steal the coat of the other virus. There are some other viruses that are already known that do this. They're called virophages. There's one which hangs around with hepatitis B. So you have hepatitis D virus, HDV, or the delta agent. This is a tiny piece of genetic material which uses the coat made by hepatitis B to encode itself and then spread. And there's another one called an adeno-associated virus. And these tiny viruses infect cells that have already got adenoviruses in them and steal the coat of the adenovirus to package up their own genetic material. So I guess you could say, yes, viruses do have viruses that prey on them. And if you could work out how to shift the balance of power between the two, you could use them to effectively disable viruses, which is what some people are trying to do.
Thanks, Sam. Let's go to Denver in Fourways. Hi.
Good morning. I would like to know, why is it that I can go to a restaurant and sit outside, I open up a can of soda, and suddenly a bee arrives? Now, when I walked in, there were no bees around, and suddenly there's a bee.
Well, we were saying earlier about birds having very good eyesight and very good sense of smell. Bees and other insects also have an excellent sense of smell, and they do it with their antennae. We have noses, and at the tops of our noses are these little arrays or sprays of nerve endings on the olfactory epithelium with receptors on for chemicals. Bees and other insects have antennae, and their antennae are covered in receptors for chemicals. And as the bee flies along and wafts its antennae through the air, it can pick up chemicals in the air, and it can also, by flying backwards and forwards, it can compare the relative intensities of those smell molecules, in other words, their concentration, and it can follow the concentration gradient to its source. And this is how bees track down flowers, and probably why flowers make smells that are attractive, because it's not just us that like the smell. Those odours are also detectable by insects, including bees. And your bottle of beer contains various volatile agents, many of which are also shared by flowers and other things that bees and other insects like. And so in the same way that when you open a really nice bottle of South African Red, and within nanoseconds there are fruit flies all over the place buzzing around because they can smell the smells which are equivalent to what comes out of rotting fruit that they want to go and eat, the animals are homing in on the volatiles coming out of your beer because it tastes good.
Yeah, that it does. Okay, I have an email here. Somebody wants to know, Chris, is there scientific explanation for why some people have a propensity to committing crimes? Is there science behind a criminal mind, or is it purely based on how you've been socialized?
That's a hard one. I think it's probably a bit of both. We know that there are some genetic things that some people carry which include having an extra copy of the Y chromosome, because in some people, when you are making sperms and eggs, for some reason in some people the sperm ends up with 2 Y chromosomes in it, or the egg ends up with an X and a Y, and then an extra Y chromosome comes in, and you get XYY, and normally a male has XY. And these individuals may have a propensity towards antisocial behaviour. There may also be some other genetic, causes or changes which might shift the balance towards behaving a certain way. We certainly think that there are certain genes that can increase the likelihood of someone having an addiction-prone personality. There are various genes in acetylcholine receptors which make you more likely to get hooked on cigarettes, for example. So we think that there might be some genes that shift the balance towards certain behaviours, but I think there's a very large amount of environmental patterning that goes on. So just because someone carries a gene, it has to interact with their environment. And if they're brought up in an environment that doesn't encourage the manifestation of that effect, then although they carry the gene, they won't necessarily turn into a criminal. So I think what it does is effectively load the developmental dice. You have an increased risk that you'll succumb to a certain lifestyle or a certain problem, but just because you carry the gene doesn't mean that you're definitely going to turn into that. And a good example of this would be alcoholism.
Oh, yes.
We know that in certain populations, especially Aboriginal populations in Australia, there is a preponderance to developing alcoholism. Individuals who never come into contact with alcohol, though, will carry the gene, but they won't ever become an alcoholic. So that's a good example of how the environment, or a stimulus in the environment, if it becomes present, can interact with the gene and cause the problem. But in the absence of that stimulus or environment, a person doesn't necessarily detect the two. So I don't think you can necessarily have one without the other.
Okay, let's go to, is it David? Thank you for your patience, David in Midrand. Debbie, I'm coming to you next. Hi, David.
Hey, Enze and Chris, morning. I've just got a question. Is it possible for a woman to be impregnated by 2 men and have twins with the same pregnancy? Like, have twins but impregnated by 2 men at the same time?
Okay.
Hi, David. I hope I'm not going to create some matrimonial disharmony by answering this question. The answer is yes, it is. In the same way that a dog has X number of puppies, a large litter of puppies, because the ovaries pump out lots of eggs at the same time, and the sperm that go into the dog will then compete to fertilise the eggs. And it's perfectly possible if a female has mated, at least in dogs, with a whole bunch of different males, there'll be a mixture of sperm in there, and that will then fertilise the eggs in the dog, and you'll have a litter which could have mixed parentage. The same thing happens with bees. A female queen bee will fly out of a nest when she's first leaving the nest and attract a comet of hundreds of male bees that will mate with the queen, and they deposit billions of sperm into the queen, and the sperm then compete, and the queen actually keeps those sperm for the rest of her life, which can be 20 years, to fertilise her eggs with, and so the eggs will have a multiple range of different fathers. If a female human multiply ovulates, which is what happens when you have non-identical twins, the ovaries pump out more than one egg. If that woman has had sex with more than one man, then there could be a mixture of sperm inside her, and assuming the timing is right, because it comes down to timing as much as anything else, because the sperm have got to be there and the eggs around at the right time. Assuming that is the case, then it's possible for her to have children by 2 different fathers at once, because she could have a twin pregnancy, and the father of each of the twins is different.
David, why do you ask?
And the other...
No, okay, no, I was just kidding. Never mind, David. Let's go to Debbie in Kew. Hi.
Hi there. I'd like to know, when primitive man started to develop, the voice box and vocal cords began to develop, and they started to make grunting noises, and so it went on. What in the environment necessitated this development?
Hello, Debbie. I'm not an expert on this, so anything I say is speculative. And you have one of the world's best people in South Africa who works on this kind of thing, so I would definitely defer to Lee Berger, who works on early man and writes beautiful books about it and lives in Joburg. But what I will say is that the enormous advantage that having the power of speech lent to early man and our ancestors is manifest very much today. We're having a conversation and passing on huge amounts of information to many, many thousands of people through the power of speech. So the enormous selective advantage that being able to communicate in a meaningful way gave to humans meant that there was enormously strong selective pressure on them to develop better and better ways of speaking meaningfully. And I think basically it's an evolutionary benefit. Early on, and I know this because when I was with Lee Berger a couple of years ago and he was showing me the Sediba fossils, intriguingly, the brain endocast of one of his specimens has got a big bulge, an asymmetry on the left-hand side of the brain in roughly the region where in modern man you see Broca's area, which is the region of the brain responsible for expressive speech. And this suggests that even though these individuals were living a couple of million years ago and were much smaller than us today and had a much smaller brain, they clearly had a development in the part of the brain that is concerned with creating speech and communicative speech. Now, it may be that they didn't have speech like we did, but it may be that that was the antecedent event that began to then put pressure on them to develop even better powers of speech and how to control their vocal cords even better. It's very speculative, though, because what we have from fossils is obviously not anything other than just the hard stuff. Softer tissues are much harder to discover in the fossil record, and therefore it's much more difficult to piece that story back together. So it's much more conjecture than actual evidence.
All right, and then we have an SMS here that says, Reedy, please ask the Naked Scientist a question that I know he'll never be able to ask. How does he prepare for the show?
With a cup of coffee and my breakfast.
And that's really
I thrive
all.
on coffee. I can't think on an empty stomach, so or without coffee. A friend of mine, Marcus de Sotoy, at Oxford University, he turned up on our show we run on the BBC, and I said, what is a mathematician? Because we're interviewing him because he's an Oxford mathematician. He said a mathematician is a biochemical machine that turns coffee into mathematical formulae. And I guess I sort of think that's a very good analogy, so I stole it. So I do the same thing. So coffee or a cup of tea and some breakfast.
Okay, you and I are the same, Chris, because I can't think until I've had 2 cups of coffee. With me, I need 2, one after the other. Then the day
I speak
begins.
too fast. I have to be careful. I limit myself on broadcasting days. I limit myself to about 1 cup of strong coffee, because otherwise I go too quick. And it scares people. It scares me. Because I listen back to recordings and I think, oh my God, that's about 5,000 words a minute.
I'm going to replay all the conversations we've had over 3 years and try to pick up when we had more than 1 cup of coffee. Marva is disputing the 2 cups of coffee from my side. Says, no, it's 3. He's lying, of course, as he always does. Thanks.
There's a guy in, I'll just tell you this before I go. There's a guy in Scotland, here in the UK, and he decided to go and see whether a cup of coffee from a coffee shop meant the same thing in a range of different shops. And so he went into all these different coffee bars around Glasgow where he works, and he ordered an espresso, took it out of the shop, immediately froze it in methanol, went back to his laboratory and tested how much caffeine it contained, and the variety was so huge. Some of the shops were serving up a portion of coffee that had 50 micrograms of caffeine. That's not unreasonable. Mm-hmm. But then another shop down the road for the same coffee, 300. Really? So you could get 600% more caffeine for the same hit.
Yes.
And so you have to be a bit careful, because the point they're making is that women who are pregnant, we know that there's a small increase in risk of miscarriage beyond a certain intake of coffee or caffeine on a daily basis. And so you could very easily, if you have 1 coffee, put yourself 3 or 4 times over the safe limit. So be careful with coffee. Strong stuff in some of these coffee bars.
Wow, I'm speechless. All right, that's it. No more coffee. Cheers, Chris.
No,
I'll
it's
chat to you next
fine.
week.
Take care. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.